Hello, hi, how are you? And welcome to another podcast by George. Well, here we are back on the video. And the man with the radio face is in front of the camera once again. Believe it or not, some people request this. They like it. I don't know why, but they want to see a video. And I thought we would start this podcast this way because this is a podcast by George of a different color, of a different kind. This is what I call turning the tables. My good friend, my old friend, Julie Gammack from the WHO broadcasting days is starting her own podcast, and she needed some help getting it together and setting up her equipment and that kind of stuff. So she called on me, which I'm honored and was happy to do. And while we were getting together, she decided to do kind of a practice podcast, actually, for her debut. And it was an interview of me. So instead of being the interviewer, I'm the interviewee. That's the part that is the turning of the tables that I thought was interesting. And I thought I would, because it is all about me, I thought I would start off with this video. I don't know, maybe just so you could have a current look at me. I don't know why, on video. But, the interview with Julie was interesting because it's the kind of thing where if I had been talking or doing a rant like I sometimes do, I would never get into the kind of things that we talked about in this interview. I wouldn't get into some of the personal details that she kind of quizzed me about. She's a good interviewer. That's what she used to do. I mean, that's what she was on talk radio, was a host with guests, and she knows how to do that. So this is kind of interesting. It's a pretty good story, a pretty good backgrounder on me. If you hear these podcasts and you're kind of new to them and you wonder, well, who is this guy? I think you can learn a lot by this. The other reason, before we go to the podcast, that I wanted to do this on video is so you can see the cap, see? Podcast by George. I got merch, folks. I got caps. I got shirts. I can get coffee cups. I mean, all this kind of stuff that you want with a Podcast by George logo on it. I've got it. I've just got it for me. I wear the shirt and the cap when I go out on remotes so that, people know who I am. I don't wear both at the same time usually, but I'll wear one or the other, particularly when I'm going to media events, because the first thing they want to know is who are you with? And sometimes they expect me to say NBC or, CNN. Well, I'm not with any of those folks. I'm with a podcast. Well, okay. What podcast? Well, Podcast by George. And they kind of give you a blank stare and go, what's the name of it? No, it is. It's Podcast by George. Well, who are you? Well, I'm George. Honest to God, I've had this conversation. So I wear the cap, I wear the shirt, and it helps overcome that. And I wanted you to have a look at the merch and see my illustrious podcasting studio here, I guess, where I do the rants and the one-sided. And I actually do the phone interviews here, too, over the computer. So you kind of get a feel for where I'm at when I'm doing the podcast. But let's go to Julie Gammack's podcast here, calling this Turning the Tables, as she interviews Podcast by George. Here's Julie.
Well, I am here in my living room with the one and only George A. Clark.
Hello, hi, how are you? And welcome to a podcast with Julie.
Yay!
Yeah.
Hey, where'd you get that hey, how are you intro?
That goes way back to my first job in radio. I started as a disc jockey. Surprise, surprise.
In Des Moines?
Yeah, just outside of Des Moines, a little 500-watt daytimer. And I used to start my show with, hello, hi, how are you? And I was George A., your DJ. So, for instance, today, it would be George A. on a Thursday. And, I mean, this was back in the day. So,
yeah.
with all the picks that click on the music go around, you put on the DJ voice. And then I used to end the show. That was my open. And then the ending was always, bygone, see you later, be careful, look out, duck, don't hurt yourself. And we'll do this all over again tomorrow, same place, same time.
I love it.
With George A., your DJ.
This is an experimental recording, which may or may not end up being heard by anyone else but the two of us. But let's just say it is going to be. So I'll set the context here of why we're together. George A. Clark and I were colleagues back in the 1980s at WHO Radio, your 50,000-watt clear channel station. And George was the news guy, and that's when radio really did news well. What would you agree with that?
Well, yeah, it was, and of course, just like so many things, the internet killed the biggest benefit of broadcast news and certainly radio news. There was no more immediate news medium than radio.
Right.
Even television took a little bit longer to get it up to speed, to get it going. As an example, when Kennedy was shot. I mean, radio was first. I mean, and with storms, for instance, so a lot of times the TV stations couldn't get it on at all, and if they did, they couldn't get their pictures out. But radio was where everybody turned. I mean, that was the most immediate news that you could get, which is what I really like, because I tell people there's Cool Hand Luke and then there's Hot Hand George. I'm kind of I like the fast, the speed element of it, Now, accuracy, as I tell people, sometimes with me and us back in the day, might be in question, but nobody was faster. And I really like that. Yeah.
Unlike print, where your mistakes linger on
Forever.
for days and days, radio is
right. And you don't have an excuse. When print, you've got the time to get it right. So get it right.
Well,
there's an editor that expects you to do that.
There used to be.
Yeah, there used to be. In radio, they expect you to get it on.
Right.
I mean, have most of it right, hopefully. Yeah, and then clean it up later if you need to.
So back to setting the context for why George and I are together, I have been admiring George from afar on his latest hobby as a retired guy, because he's entered the world of podcasting. And I love podcasts, and George is one of my go-to podcasts. And the reason being is he not only knows what he's doing, but he has a niche, and it's a niche that I'm interested in, which is says a lot about the whole podcasting Wild West going on right now, that if somebody can find a niche that's of interest to people, you can be George A. the DJ or whatever. So I've been intrigued with this whole concept of podcasts and thought, by golly, I'm going to do a podcast, because one of the things I miss most about being involved in the media is going out and talking to people and getting their stories. And when you don't have an excuse, they think you're pretty nosy or weird. But if you can say, hey, I've got this podcast, I'd like to interview you, or a column or what have you, they're much more open to sitting down with you. So I think of all the people in Iowa especially, that would be my niche, because that's I'm Iowan through and through. All of the people I know that I would love to sit down and get their stories recorded before it's too late. I'm at that end of the age spectrum where there are a lot of these people I would wish that I could have interviewed, and it's too late. So George is my inspiration, and he's also my teacher.
Oh, I appreciate that.
And he is teaching me how to do podcasts. So I'm gonna interview you as if you are my first interviewee. So George, where are you from originally?
Well, I'm from Norwalk. I grew up in the shadow of Des Moines, and a lot of this kind of stuff has been on my podcast also. But I am a niche. I'm unique. I'm an Iowa boy through and through. I've lived here my entire life. I grew up on a farm on a dirt road. Now, very few people know what that's like. I mean,
right.
And we had to wait for the road to be rocked, but compared to people of today, with the 6 degrees or less of separation and the connection that we all have with one another around the world, I couldn't have grown up more isolated on a dirt road, because when it rained, nobody came in, nobody went out. There were days growing up on the farm where we didn't see anybody but the mailman, and that's if the road was dry enough for him to get down it. So the farms were self-sufficient, and they were a world unto their own, and families were different because of that back then. And that was my, very, very humble upbringing.
Did you listen to the radio? Is that what piqued your
radio
interest?
was a big thing. The farmers of the day listened to WHO, and my dad was a farmer, so we listened to that. And then I, went on to work for WHO. He was also a big country music fan. He grew up on the same farm that I did.
Wow.
When he was a kid, he and a bunch of buddies jumped in a Model A Ford and went to the Grand Ole Opry. And so he was a country music fan, and so he would listen to some radio stations that weren't WHO to get that country and Western music, but it was mostly WHO.
What's happened to the farm?
Interesting again, reflective of what's happening in America. It was in a family-held trust with my grandmother. When she passed away, it was divided up amongst, it was sold and then divided up among her heirs, and it now is part of a golf course. Oh. The only recognizable feature of the farm that still exists is part of a golf course, and there are $1 million homes located all over the fields that I worked as a kid.
How does it feel to go? Do you go back there?
Yeah.
Yeah. How does that feel?
Yeah, it makes you feel old. Yeah.
Yeah.
It makes me think that the family didn't get near what they should have out of the property for what it's become. But even then, 120 acres wasn't enough, really, and some of that wasn't tillable, but it wasn't enough for our family to live on. So my dad had a trucking and excavating firm, and he drove a truck over the road for a while, but he went into trucking and he operated both things. And I grew up in, kind of a one-half heavy equipment operator, truck driver, and the other half a farm boy.
Do you miss the farm? Do you miss growing things? Do you grow things?
Yeah, I miss it. The isolation was hard for a young man growing up then. Farming has changed, so I miss something that doesn't exist any longer, the way that we live. Farming is like a lot of professions. It's kind of like being a cop or something like that. It's 95% boredom and 5% white-knuckle terror.
Yeah.
I mean, farming is a dangerous occupation if you're working with livestock and that kind of heavy equipment and that type of thing. So, that's what I remember from the farm. I miss some of it. I miss the fact that it was a highly defined square peg in a square hole vocation. Mm-hmm. You knew exactly what you were doing every step of the way. You weren't figuring out as you went along. It couldn't have been more analog. There was no digital to farming, especially back in the day.
You think how you grew up in isolation relative to today, and look at kids that age today and what occupy, their iPads, their iPhones, their technology, the internet. What are they missing?
What are they missing? They are missing. I don't know but when you say missing, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're missing something good. You got to understand. I grew up isolated. I grew up redneck. I grew up underneath the domain of a male-dominated household. Around alcoholic truck drivers and farmers and stuff like that. So they're missing the very masculine, very machismo-driven, very old-fashioned way that I grew up. Is that a bad thing? I'm not so sure. But it was a completely different world. There was no, people talk about the nanny state. The nanny state did not apply when I was a kid. Mothers raised young boys till they got to be, 10 years old, got old enough to come under the domain of the father and go out in the field and work. And after that, it was a man's world. And that's the world that I grew up in, so it's different.
Yeah, well, and you're fairly evolved at this stage of life. How did that happen?
School of hard knocks.
Yeah.
Oh God, Julie. I mean, we could go through this there's so many different ways to look at this, but I was the first child to go to college in the family, so that had something to do with it. I was a broadcast news major, journalism major, so I followed the news and had my eyes wide open and grew up through the Vietnam era and had a little bit more of a worldly perspective, I think, because of my education and because of the fact that I was dialed into the media of the day, and it just grew from that, I think.
Was there a separation that grew between you and your family of origin as a result of that, or?
To a certain extent, they were very proud of me for being the first one to go to college. They were somewhat liberal-minded. They were Democrats. So, that helped. For instance, in the Vietnam War, fortunately, I was of the age to where the war ended before I got drafted, thank God, by a year or two. But I think it was fairly well decided in my family that I was not going to go to the Vietnam War. We all knew by that point, like much of America did, that it was all for naught, that people were dying in vain. My family had already sent its young men off to war that were going to go, and I wasn't going to do it, and so I wasn't going to go. I didn't have to make that choice, fortunately.
You quite literally dodged a bullet.
Yeah. One of the things I'm most proud of, my grandfather is a World War I hero. He's one of the most highly decorated soldiers of World War I. So there is a military tradition or history in my family, but my dad kind of broke that because my grandfather came home wounded and disillusioned, and they were not big military supporters. My dad didn't go in the Korean conflict, probably could have, but he got out of it, I think probably because of my grandfather's service, helped him with that. And I wasn't going to go.
Interesting.
No.
Those were interesting times.
Yeah, unless you live through it, people just don't realize.
No,
It shaped us all.
It sure did.
And it shaped me. And to answer your question, that probably had a lot to do with how I evolved.
Yeah, interesting. So radio, television, that was something you decided while you were in college? It was the path you wanted to...
Yeah, the story I tell people is I showed up to the admissions office late my freshman year at college and told them, well, I'm not real good at math and I didn't do real well in science. And I can write a little bit, and I can talk. And the woman at the table admissions counter there said, well, you sound like a journalism major. We'll put you in the J school, and since you can talk, we'll put you in the broadcast school. So that's how I got in. I mean, that's how it happened.
Wow, interesting.
Yeah.
And the rest
Thank
is...
God for her. I don't know who it was, but there you go.
Well, was radio good to you?
In some ways, from an experience standpoint, I certainly enjoyed it, and I like some of the people that I met. But as far as a career is concerned, and it's not radio's fault necessarily, the golden era was ending. As you know, you were a part of it. I mean, It was coming to, it was on its last legs, or some people might even say flat on its ass. I mean, it was coming to a close at that time. It was not what it used to be. So I came to it late. So I can't blame the profession that much. There was not enough money there for me, and I had to pull the plug on it, go make a living, and put aside enough money that allows me to be retired today. If I'd stayed in radio, that would not be the case. I know some guys that did. I mean, they're still working overnights, and not for me.
One thing I found fascinating as I got to know people in broadcasting, particularly radio, is how many of them were actually shy in real life, that they got behind a microphone and by golly, they were, they were just full of it. And boy, you'd put them in any kind of social situation and they'd hug the wall. And I found that fascinating.
No, I see that a lot. I'm a little bit that way to myself. I mean, I can grab a microphone on a 50,000 watt clear channel radio station, just like you're describing, and talk to the world. But you put me in an auditorium in front of a large group of people like you do sometimes. I can't do that. That would make me very nervous. Matter of fact, I even went to some Toastmasters. I was in Toastmasters for a while to kind of have a little remedial 101 training or something like that, to where I could get up and speak in front of groups, because it is different.
It is.
I mean, you're speaking to yourself, but you're speaking. I don't know. It's different. It's completely different. Yeah.
What was news radio like back then? This was, let's see, I was on the air on WHO when they were in the old building, and also was the first to broadcast when they moved to the new building. So that was a pretty cool thing to be a part of. But I remember that old studio, and you guys had, you had staff in there.
Yeah,
that was pretty amazing.
Yeah, I was hired as originally came on as the overnight editor for WHO. We had a full-time news person on overnight at a radio station.
Wow.
Now hardly any radio station anywhere has one news person. But it was a throwback. It was a throwback to the golden era of Jack Shelley and Herb Planbeck and all of those guys that had fully staffed news writers with beats, very similar to the newsroom of a newspaper, major metropolitan newspaper. And I didn't fully appreciate it because I never had really hardly been any place else. A lot of the smaller radio stations had a news person or two, but I was kind of shocked and surprised, just like you were, when I got to WHO and saw this newsroom. What a great thing. But that was part of the golden era, that was ending. And so I made the jump from overnights to morning drive with Bob Wilbanks, and did that for 5 years or so, and then it all it was falling apart. End of news radio, and several large markets had it. I think our format came from a station in Chicago. WCCO at Minneapolis had a news radio format.
What year did they do away with news radio?
Well, I mean, it was right when we were there.
Lucky
when
us.
that fairness doctrine ended in, what was it, 86 or 85, 86, 87 in there when they got rid of that. I mean, that fairly well shot a hole in news radio, and that gave rise to Rush Limbaugh and that form of talk radio that got rid of the era that you were involved with. And if people remember you and Susan Bray and John London and all of those kind of people, that kind of talk radio ended.
Right.
With the syndication of Rush Limbaugh. No fairness doctrine, say whatever you want, any way you want, be completely biased, non-transparent. People still don't realize, though he's told them, that Rush Limbaugh is an entertainer. He's not a truth teller, never intended to be. They didn't realize that originally, I don't think. I don't know if a lot of people realize it now.
Today.
Yeah.
So tell me about what you've learned doing these podcasts. When did you start them?
I didn't start the podcast until sometime almost a year after I retired. So it was last September.
Which is what year? Since
It'd be 2018, September.
2018.
Yeah. Started doing them, and the story behind that is actually I went and visited one of the stations I used to work at, and I was talking to the people at the station, and I was listening to what they were doing, and I can do this. I mean, I'm fully capable of doing this or better.
Yes.
Yeah, so I decided to give it a try. A lot of my, and I thought about podcasts, but friends and family and stuff, God, you got to go back on the radio. And the line that I use for that is, going back on the radio would be like dating my ex-wife. It might seem kind of tricky to start with, but it's probably not going to end well. You've got all that history, that, you know what I mean? Right. People try that, actually, to get back together after divorces and years of separation. It doesn't work usually. So that's not going to work for me. I can't get back on a radio station, I don't think. But a podcast, pretty close. I'm in charge. I set the agenda. I set the hours. I decide the topics. It's everything that you want to do in radio but never can do. So
let's say that somebody listening right now has just discovered the world of podcasts for some reason, and they think, how hard is that to do? So how would you answer that question?
No, it's not hard to do.
Well,
yeah, I mean, you can check out a YouTube tutorial and get your own. You can do a podcast with your phone, and a lot of people do. It's just how much time you want to put into it, how high quality you want it to be, how hard you want to work at it, what your expectations are. My expectations, I find that I'm well served by having low expectations. So I just want to. My main point of doing Podcast by George is, and I said this on my first podcast, and I tell folks this all the time, I'm not overly talented. I have this ability to do a little bit of radio, but I'm not a good athlete. I'm not a musician. I'm not a deep thinker. But I know a lot of people that are.
Yeah.
And I want to share that with people because these people are really good that I know. Some of them just haven't, for whatever reason, had the opportunity to share it with others. The podcast gives me that opportunity. I feel good about that. Yeah. And this guy is really good. This woman is really smart. You got to listen to what they have to say, and the podcast gives me that opportunity.
Do you have a format? Do you have a niche that you would describe Podcast by George?
Well, the subtitle is News, Blues, and Interviews. Now, I can cover just about everything, but you can get the news everywhere. But the way I phrase it or frame it is I will pick things to bring forward. Some of it's just in the form of a rant. Some of it's with interviews or whatever. But it's kind of a real deal Heartland perspective on things because when I see the news and when I hear things, and I wish they would get to this. I wish that they would cover this angle. And they're missing the point, and they're telling it a lot of times from an East or a West Coast perspective where your media centers are. That's the way that it used to be. So this is a heartland perspective. A lot of people value that, particularly right now.
Yeah.
Because of the political scene and the Iowa caucuses and all that. Everybody wants to know what people in Iowa are really like, what they really think. Well, listen to my podcast. You'll find out what I really think anyway and what I'm really like. And I've lived here my whole life. I'm an Iowan through and through. My background's maybe a little different than most, but, a lot of people's are. So I have that on there. That's the news angle. The music part of it is blues, but it's also rock and roll. I have quite a bit of blues on. There's a lot of blues right now. There's blues, but people know that. There's a lot of blues bars and blues musicians everywhere. Why? Well, the old rockers are getting older. Yeah. Blues music is a little bit more formula. I mean, I like it, don't get me wrong, and I like blues music, but guys that, can't get up and shake it and break it anymore, they can't write the lyrics or the music, the complexity of some of the rock opera music of our 70s youth and that type of thing. They'll fall back and do the blues. So there's a lot of blues on there, but I also like to have some of the rock on there. Mm-hmm. Blues doesn't need preserving. There's all kinds of blues preservation societies, literally. What needs to be brought forward, if you can find it, is rock and roll music. There's not much of it anymore. We're all dying, So, I've got rock music on there. And then the interviews are people that cover all genres, news, the music category. Also have some hockey stuff on there because I'm a hockey player still. I play men's league hockey, so I have hockey stuff.
So you seem to be successful in this. If anybody was asking my advice about doing a podcast, not that I have any advice to give, it would be to pick one niche and stick to it. But you managed to have all kinds of domains and aspects of life under one heading, and it's working for you.
And if that's the case, then you need to do podcasts fairly regularly. If you're going to do 12 podcasts a year, one a month...
That might be me.
Well, then you maybe need to stick to one thing.
Yeah.
But if you're going to be more prolific like I am, I started this in September.
Yeah.
I'm on my 84th podcast right now.
Wow.
Yeah, that's how many of these things... I can put together one every 3 or 4 days or whatever. Well, people then that are just... and it's amazing to me. I talk about this sometimes. It's amazing people come and say, I really like the music. Why don't you? I don't care about that politics shit, though. Why don't you just do music? And then people come up to me and say, God, I hate that music. Just do politics, And then other people come up and say, yeah, I really like you. Why don't you just do you? I mean, I just want to hear from you.
Yeah.
Tell stories about yourself. Then 2/3 of my audience is not interested in that. Or the hockey. Not a lot of people.
Not a lot of people. No.
But when there's 84, ignore the 7 hockey episodes and go listen to the other 77. Yeah.
So, what podcast do you listen to?
Myself. Well, that's the irony of this. Podcasts are by and large the domain of younger people. Older people do listen to them, but not like younger people. I didn't listen to a lot of podcasts. Mm-hmm. I listen to Joe Rogan, and I'm interested in some of the things that he covers. A lot of those things I'm not. I listen to some progressive stuff. The older I get, Julie, and we've talked about this, the more progressive I'm becoming. So I listen to there's a guy named Jimmy Dore. He's a comedian out of California, very progressive, big YouTuber, Young Turks, that kind of stuff. I'll listen to that.
Save America?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the thing of it is, when you do 84 since September, I barely have time to listen to my own podcast. You got to listen to them. After you do them, you have to edit them. Mm-hmm. And I try to do them professionally and try to do them well. So doing the podcast and then doing the post-production and then getting them on the air takes up a lot of my time, that and playing hockey and doing the retired thing.
So when you've been trying, bless your heart, you've been trying to teach me how to do this and talking to me over the phone about how to format a SDK card and all of that stuff. And I go through these periods of thinking, I don't want to learn all this. And here you are today. You are very kind to make me sit down and learn how to do this. So thank you. So again, going back to somebody, if they're at all interested in starting a podcast, how do you get it out there?
I recommend a syndicating service. You can do a podcast and just send it to your own email list if you want to. Uh-huh. But if you use a syndicator like Libsyn, which is the one that I use, I podcast, upload it, and they syndicate it to every platform that accepts podcasts, basically. So Podcast by George is, people say, well, where do you get it? Well, where can't you get it almost? I mean, it's on YouTube, it's on Twitter, it's on Spotify, and Facebook is where most of my listenership comes from. But
really?
Yeah, it syndicates it there. Stitcher and Google Play and
But Libsyn does this for you?
Yeah.
They put it
Yep.
out on all those platforms?
yeah.
And what's the cost for that?
You know, a plan is available kind of to whatever your budget is. I mean, and it has to do with how many millibytes, megabytes, whatever you use per month. You know, I would say Libsyn, you can get in for as little as $10 a month, and if you're spending $30 a month, you've got a pretty large podcast.
So the initial cost, let's say you want to do it right, and you want to get
the equipment.
the Zoom microphone like I
yeah.
have, and the Shure mic, or the Zoom recorder and the Shure microphones,
Yeah.
and the startup cost to do it right, do it
Yeah,
professionally.
you've got nice stuff. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, you may inherit it.
Yeah.
But you think about $1,500?
Oh, I don't know if you spent that much.
I don't think so.
Yeah, I'm thinking I spent about. Of course, I bought the recorder used and all that, but I think start to finish, everything I've got probably is $500 or less.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So you buy the equipment, and then you decide who you're going to interview, and you interview them, and then you go back and put the audio file on your computer. I'm going to try and learn how to do GarageBand because I'm a Mac person, but you use audio file.
Audacity.
Audacity.
Yeah.
And you edit it. Do you cut out ums and ahs? That seems
If it's real bad. As you do it, you will do less of that, so you'll have less to clean up for yourself. Mm-hmm. For your interviewees, unless it's really egregious and really bad, I pretty much leave it in there because it is who they are. It's how they talk. So I leave that in there. Now I put in some effects, some special effects in my recordings and things, and I have an open, and I use intro and outro music. Bob Pace does a lot of the music that opens and closes my shows. John Schaefer, the voice of Channel 5 Sports, introduces me, and I put that on each one of them. And I like when I'm interviewing somebody and I am picking up a clip of something that they did before, like a musician. I have a Wayback Machine that is a sound effect that that gives you that's kind of fun. It's kind of old fashioned, but I mean I put that in there. And as you go along, you get a little more astute at those things. And it's fun.
Now, are you able to monitor how long a listener will stay with the podcast? Can you tell whether they listen to the whole thing or they drop out after 10 minutes?
Facebook can tell you how many people listen for, I don't know, a certain period of time in their 30 seconds, listen at least 30 seconds, so that they didn't click on it accidentally. And so that you didn't get a download by mistake, for instance.
Now, does Facebook then advertise on your content? Do they make money off of your content?
They can, but you got to reach a level that's way above anywhere we'll ever be.
Okay.
I mean, then you are talking about people like Joe Rogan, as an example, to have Facebook advertising or YouTube
Now, does Joe
advertising.
Rogan get any of that?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
There are people that are making very good livings on podcasting, believe me. Yeah, he makes a lot of money, yeah. But that's never going to be our world. I mean, I'm too small, got in too late, don't know, don't care, everybody always asks me, how many people listen to your podcast? Well, I got about 4,000 downloads right now, but here's the thing. The first time I keyed the mic at WHO on a 50,000-watt clear channel radio station, border to border, coast to coast, and at night, literally was all over North America, and I mean, you could get the atmospheric bounce that would put you into radio-free Europe if you wanted to. Well, the first time I keyed the mic, I had, I don't know, tens of thousands of listeners probably. Every truck driver in America was listening to Country Music USA with John France, and I was doing the news on that. So I've been there. I've done that. I don't need that. I mean, that's not why I do this.
No, I know it's not why you do, but I'm curious as to, if a tree falls in the forest, do people hear it? If people put a podcast out, does anybody listen to it?
Well, Libsyn has your downloads. I mean, that's one of the benefits of the syndicating service. They have a nice stats package, and it gets more elaborate as you spend more money on it. But that's how I know how many people have downloaded my episodes. I know where they live, for instance, and I know some general demographics from Facebook, for instance, men, women, age groups that are downloading it. So you can kind of get a general picture. But my podcast, for instance, is mostly listened to by an older audience like me, mostly in North America, but I've got listeners in. I always brag about the fact I got some woman that listens to me in Malta. I think that's cool. I had to get out a map to find out where she was listening from, But people listen in Canada because I have the hockey stuff. But, I've had people listen in Indonesia. I got some folks that listen in Switzerland that are regular listeners. And
I love it. I love it. So what are some of the podcasts that stick out in your mind that you've recorded?
I would say, because they're friends of mine, the music podcasts are kind of near and dear to my heart. I really like them. Plus, they have the music on them, which is really good. So you get the interesting interview with the musicians, and then you get to listen to their music. And I have some of those on there. Bob Pace is a really close friend of mine. And I would encourage people to check him out on there. Fascinating person, great musician, great songs. Really like his stuff. And then on the news side, I'm actually able to, let's say one of my favorite podcasts probably is one with Jerry Berry, which has a link to Julie Gammack.
Really?
Yeah, Jerry Berry, he's a Simpson graduate, graduated during the Vietnam War, enlisted in the Marine Corps because his father was a Marine, and was the man at the controls of the last helicopter out in Vietnam. He was the guy that was getting people out of the embassy, and we've all saw those iconic photographs of those people coming off the embassy roof as we evacuated Saigon at the end of the Vietnam War. That was Jerry Berry.
Wow.
And if people, it'll make the hair stand up on the back of your neck. He tells some great stories in that podcast, and I don't want to ruin it, or I don't want to where your listeners
Spoiler alert.
Yeah, I mean, check it out because it takes a while to get the story told. That's a great one. The one with the Vietnam War hero, Jerry Berry from Simpson College, and he's, that's a good one.
Tune in.
I listened to Craig Ellingson talk about his son. He was the hockey player that drowned down at the Lake of the Ozarks, bounced out of the back of that boat by that state trooper that had him handcuffed behind his back. And there was a big lawsuit involved in that. Nobody was convicted. It goes on to this day. That's a very good podcast also. A lot of these things tend to be sad. I'll just mention two others that I'm really proud of, and again, sad circumstances, but that's kind of what the news is, kind of sad a lot of times. I got to tell you. One was a revisit with the Humboldt Broncos. That's that bus of hockey players up in Western Canada a little over a year ago that was hit by a semi and killed just about everybody on the bus. Horrible crash. Well, I went back and talked to the guy that was the president of the Humboldt Broncos board at the time, who had a billet son, as he's called, a boy on the bus that was killed, and we to find out how they were recovering. And that's a great podcast. And then the last one, again, this gets into Julie Gammack world a little bit, because I interviewed a survivor of the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas high school shooting out of Parkland, Florida, Rebecca Schneid. She was in Des Moines on a speaking tour for and it's going to escape me here, Julie, help me out a little bit, that precedent-setting U.S. Supreme Court case where the junior high students, high school students...
Oh, the Tinker case.
The Tinker case. She was up here to sell... Yeah, exactly, and you know all about that. She was up here for the Tinker case anniversary.
That's when students at Roosevelt High School wore black armbands and were suspended, and the Iowa Civil Liberties Union attorney, Dan Johnston, took that case all the way to the United States Supreme Court.
And they won. School said, you can't do that. And they said, yes, we can. Mm-hmm. And, of course, that's very important for those students down there at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas to be able to speak their mind, because, as you know, they're going around the country talking about these killer guns and wanting to get something done about it based on their perspective, which is very unique. But the thing that was so heart-wrenching, and what makes that a great podcast, is I interview Rebecca Schneid. She's also the co-editor of the Eagle Eye, the school newspaper down there. But she has a book. Actually, she appears in a couple of books post that shooting down there. And I asked her in the podcast, just to read. She wrote a poem. I said, okay, read your poem. She wrote this poem entitled Zoo Animal that she wrote.
Wow.
Because that's the way she feels. That's the way that they are 1 year after that horrific shooting down there.
Oh my
and there's a
God.
huge PTSD element associated with this, of course. 2 students have already committed suicide. One of the fathers has killed himself. And it's a part of it. And they understand people want to know, and they understand that people want to hear the story and that type of thing, but they kind of feel like they're being looked at, like they're being examined, like they're being watched, somewhat like a zoo animal. And my God, she started to read that on the podcast.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So, yeah, sad. A highlight for the podcast, yeah, but a low light in American history and in this country, that horrific shooting and these guns, just unbelievable.
And George, what a perfect underscoring of why the podcast format is so important. You know, those are stories that we lose throughout history if they aren't recorded and preserved. And of course, you know, telling a story in print is very different from hearing a young woman read a poem she wrote about her experience.
Exactly. You got to hear her voice.
Yeah.
You got to hear her youthfulness, and you've got to hear her sorrow, and you've got to hear the timbre in her voice. It's and really, to be real truthful, it's kind of flat. It's kind of opaque. She's kind of I don't know. I mean, it'll get to you, boy.
Yeah.
I mean, it was something else.
Yeah. Well, George, thank you. You're an inspiration.
I don't hear that very often.
Well, you are. I mean, you've always been a wonderful newsman in my experience of you. But the kinds of stories you're telling through your podcast and your gifts and skills as an interviewer are really important to tell, whether 100,000 people listen or whatever. So thank you for doing it, and thank you for nudging me. We'll see where this goes.
Yeah, well, I'm looking forward to it. I mean, and you have got the connections and the network, and the thing about it is, at our age where we're at, there isn't anybody that doesn't have stories.
That's
I
right.
mean, God, that's what it's all about. It is storytelling in its essence.
You know, my dad had a value that he fortunately passed on to me, and it was born of necessity because he had to hammer out a newspaper column 7 days a week, plus do a weekly television show.
People have no idea.
They have no idea
Yeah.
what that's like. But the legacy I have from him that I'm most proud of is there's a story in everyone.
There you go. Yeah, Gordon Gammack.
All
Man,
right.
the greatest. That's right. Yeah.
Thanks, George.
Thank you, Julie.
All right. That's it.